Being completely isolated at the old drawbridge over the Kiskachee River isn't just quiet, it's a heavy, suffocating dampness that gets into your bones. By 2 a.m., the dense river fog always rises so high it completely swallows the lower steel spans, cutting the elevated operator's booth off from the rest of the world. This massive iron structure, built back in the late 1940 seconds, is constantly shifting and making its own unsettling noises. The metal cools down after the day, the rusted beams groan against the midnight wind, and the black water below slaps dully against the concrete pillars. You learn to block it out. But that night, around 2:30 a.m., the entire river valley went dead silent. Not even the sound of cricket chirps or water movement remained. Samuel sat behind the glowing control panel, checking the old analog pressure dials. His task was simple: watch the dark river for rare commercial barges and raise the massive spans on a strict nighttime schedule. Suddenly, a small red motion sensor light on the secondary panel began to blink rapidly. It was impossible. The bridge had been closed to all vehicle traffic for months due to extensive road repairs, and pedestrians hadn't used this route in years. Samuel leaned forward, squinting at the low-resolution CRT monitor displaying the left-wing approach. Through the swirling gray fog, at the very edge of the broken asphalt where the road ended over the water, a tall figure stood perfectly motionless. The person wore a heavy dark winter coat that looked completely soaked, with streams of water visibly running down to the ground, even though there hadn't been a drop of rain all night. The stranger didn't take a single step. He just stood there, tilting his head back at an unnatural angle, staring straight up at the thick glass window of the elevated operator's booth. Wishing to clear his doubts, Samuel reached over and switched on the bridge's powerful external searchlight. The intense, cool white beam cut violently through the fog, illuminating the figure entirely. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The stranger's skin was a sickly, translucent white, and his body proportions looked completely deformed. His arms were unnaturally long, hanging down like heavy ropes along his torso, with elongated fingers that reached well past his knees. He didn't blink or react to the blinding light shining directly into his eyes. A sudden power surge caused the heavy searchlight to flicker twice before dying out completely, plunging the exterior back into dim moonlight. When Samuel looked back at the monitor, the edge of the asphalt was empty. The figure had vanished into the mist in a split second. Then a low, metallic thud echoed from the dark utility rooms located directly beneath the cabin floorboards. Someone was climbing the vertical iron ladder that led from the concrete base straight to the control room. The footsteps were heavy, uneven, and deeply unsettling. One distinct loud boot strike against the metal rungs, followed by a long, wet, dragging sound, as if the intruder were pulling a completely useless heavy leg behind them. Panic taking over, Samuel scrambled across the small cabin, throwing his weight against the heavy steel entrance door and forcing the manual deadbolt into place. At that exact moment, the main generator groaned and died, cutting off the lights and the control panel. The absolute darkness was broken only by the dim screen of his smartphone. The heavy limping footsteps stopped right outside the locked door. For a minute, there was nothing but the sound of Samuel's ragged breathing. Then came a sharp, metallic screech. Someone outside was slowly dragging a jagged, sharp object along the corrugated iron siding of the booth, deliberately searching for a gap or a weak spot in the frame. The terrifying scratching sound slowly shifted from the metal wall to the thick viewing window. Against the pale fog outside, Samuel watched a wide, pale hand press firmly against the glass. There were too many knuckles on the fingers, and the skin left a greasy, dark residue on the pane. Slowly, the stranger's face emerged from the dark, pressing flat against the glass, waiting for the phone battery to completely drain to zero. Long-haul night runs across the completely deserted highways of northern New Mexico can easily play tricks on a driver's mind. The road becomes an endless, hypnotic gray ribbon under the high beams, where the headlights only catch dead desert brush, cracked asphalt, and faded road signs. Walter had been operating heavy rigs for over 24 years. He knew how to manage sleep deprivation. But the specific cargo job he accepted at a rusted, unmapped oil depot near the border felt wrong from the moment he signed the paperwork. A group of silent men paid him 3 times his standard rate in cash to haul an old unmarked refrigerator trailer with completely blacked-out license plates. Their only demand was absolute. Under no circumstances was he to stop driving or turn off the engine until he reached the coordinates. By 3:45 a.m., the truck was moving through a deeply cut, unlit mountain canyon where cellular signal dropped entirely. Suddenly, the old CB radio on the dashboard hissed violently, with static, breaking the silence of the cabin. Walter reached over to adjust the squelch, but the white noise suddenly cleared. A flat, mechanical male voice, entirely devoid of human cadence or emotion, began reading out loud. It wasn't a broadcast. The voice was calmly reciting the exact make, custom paint color, and the current speed of Walter's truck. The voice repeated the telemetry over and over again in a loop, sounding less like a prank and more like a live report being delivered to something sitting directly behind the truck. At that exact second, the entire 15-ton semi-truck shuddered violently from the back. In the wide side mirrors, Walter watched the heavy refrigerator trailer sway dangerously from side to side, nearly pulling the cabin off the road. From inside the sealed container, a series of dull, massive impacts began to echo. Something incredibly heavy was slamming against the thick steel walls with immense force, desperate to break through the locking mechanisms. Walter glanced at the dashboard. The temperature sensor inside the trailer was suddenly spiking into extreme heat, even though the diesel cooling compressor was screaming at full capacity, trying to keep the cargo frozen. The internal blows grew faster and more chaotic, sounding like heavy iron sledgehammers throwing themselves against the metal skin. The structural rivets along the top edge of the trailer began to pop off under the pressure, snapping into the dark night air like bullets. Walter slammed his boot onto the gas pedal, forcing the engine to its absolute limit as the truck roared down the steep canyon descent. But as he rounded a sharp, blind curve, his high beams illuminated a complete blockade ahead. 3 old passenger cars had been dragged across the narrow lane, smashed together crosswise. Their doors were flung wide open, and a thick, dark engine oil was heavily pooling across the asphalt. The area was completely deserted, no hazard lights, no drivers, just an intentional trap, knowing that stopping meant death. Walter gripped the steering wheel with turning white knuckles and kept his foot pinned to the floor. The heavy steel bumper of the semi-truck crashed into the blockade with an explosive crunch of metal, scattering the smaller cars into the rocky ditches. But the violent impact was enough to finally break the damaged rear latches of his own trailer. The heavy doors swung open with a screeching, tearing sound. The internal pounding stopped instantly. Looking into his rearview mirror, Walter watched a long, pale entity moving with terrifying speed on 4 elongated insect-like joints crawl out from the dark void of the open trailer. It dropped onto the asphalt, instantly matched the truck's high speed, and began rapidly pursuing the cabin along the gravel shoulder, disappearing and reappearing in the clouds of dust. Fire Lookout Tower, deep within the dense pine forests of the Blackwood Reserve, is nothing more than an elevated cage made of glass, weathered timber, and isolation. At night, when the mountain wind completely dies down, the quiet becomes so intense it causes a constant ringing in your ears. A young temporary ranger was finishing his very first week on the night rotation. Around midnight, a thick, freezing valley fog rolled over the ridges, rising steadily until the tree line below completely disappeared from view. The tower booth was left floating like an island in a vast sea of white mist. The only connection to the outside world was an old battery-operated radio console that usually remained completely silent until dawn. Radio suddenly crackled to life at 1:15 a.m. with a heavy burst of distortion. It wasn't the main dispatcher from the valley base. A dry, rasping whisper cut through the static, speaking sentences that made the ranger's blood turn cold. The voice was calmly describing his exact physical movements inside the cabin in absolute real time. You just set down your coffee mug. You are walking toward the map table. Now you are stepping back, away from the glass. The ranger froze in place, his heart hammering against his ribs. Someone was actively watching him. But the tower cabin was suspended on solid concrete and timber pillars 40 feet above the ground. There were no structural ledges, no maintenance platforms, just a sheer vertical drop into the fog. Desperate to find the source, the ranger grabbed his tactical flashlight and pressed the beam against the eastern window pane, forcing the light down into the structure's support beams. The bright circle of light illuminated the heavy wooden cross bracing. Moving upward with an erratic spider-like agility was a living shape. Its limbs were impossibly thin and elongated, bending backward at horrific joints as its long black fingernails dug deep into the solid treated wood. The thing wore the shredded remnants of an old uniform, but its face was entirely smooth, featureless, and dominated by two oversized, glossy black eyes that reflected the flashlight beam like wet asphalt. The ranger stumbled backward, his boot catching the edge of his cot as he watched the creature climb. It didn't slow down. It scaled the vertical timbers with a sickening fluidity, completely unbothered by the sheer height or the freezing wind howling around the tower. The sound of its claws puncturing the thick wood grew louder, a sharp, rhythmic, splintering noise that echoed inside the small, glass-walled room. The radio console on the desk began to emit a high-pitched, piercing whine, the frequency distorting until it sounded like a frantic, looping recording of a woman sobbing in the distance. Suddenly, the audio went dead silent, and the scratching noise stopped right beneath the outer floorboards. The ranger held his breath, staring down at his feet, his flashlight shaking violently in his grip. In the absolute quiet, the old wooden planks began to creak and bend under an immense, localized weight directly outside the trapdoor. A second later, the heavy brass padlock on the hatch violently rattled as something from underneath began to slam against the wood. A long, ash-white hand with too many joints forced its way through a narrow gap between the floorboards, its black fingernails blindly scraping against the linoleum, trying to widen the opening. The automated car wash located on the dark edge of the industrial district felt like a concrete tomb at 3 a.m. A driver, completely exhausted after a 12-hour interstate trip, pulled his dust-covered sedan into the narrow wash bay to clean off the road grime before heading home. He inserted his credit card into the wall terminal. The mechanical overhead sprayers groaned to life with a hiss of high pressure, and the heavy metal rolling shutter doors behind his car dropped down to the concrete floor with a resounding, echoing thud. The automated cycle began immediately, burying the entire vehicle in a dense, suffocating layer of thick chemical foam that completely blocked any view of the exterior walls. As the massive spinning cloth brushes began to violently slam against the frame of the sedan, the overhead neon lighting tubes flickered severely and died out, plunging the bay into darkness. The constant, reassuring hum of the high-pressure water pumps suddenly slowed down to a low, unnatural mechanical groan. Through the thick layers of colored soap slowly sliding down the driver's side glass, a distinct shape materialized. A tall, emaciated silhouette was standing perfectly upright right next to the driver's door, completely undisturbed by the freezing torrents of recycled water and heavy chemicals blasting through the enclosed space. The water flow abruptly cut off entirely, leaving the bay in absolute silence, broken only by a single blinking red emergency light on the wall. Then came a sound that didn't belong to any machinery. Someone was slowly, deliberately, dragging heavy metallic claws across the roof of the car, tearing through the clear coat with a terrifying high-pitched screech. The thin steel roof began to buckle downward under a sudden immense weight from above, the metal groaning loudly under the pressure. Through the thinning soap suds on the front windshield, two pale, elongated hands slammed hard against the glass, pressing down with enough mechanical force to make the heavy safety glass spiderweb, with deep, splintering cracks right in front of the driver's face. The car's factory alarm suddenly began to blare, its horn honking in a frantic, broken rhythm that echoed violently off the enclosed concrete walls of the bay. The dashboard display panel shorted out, flashing error codes before dying completely. Locked inside the metal frame of his own car, the driver watched as the heavy, cracked windshield began to cave inward under the weight of whatever was kneeling on the hood. The automated rolling doors showed no signs of opening, and his phone display read "No service" within the reinforced structure. From directly above his head, the sound of metal tearing apart filled the cabin as the creature began to violently strip away the rubber weather stripping from the driver's side door frame, its long, pale fingers working their way through the narrow seal. The lowest level of the municipal archive facility sits 3 stories beneath the city streets, forming a vast, freezing labyrinth of rusted iron shelves and endless rows of decaying, yellowed paper records. An overnight data clerk was assigned to scan old patient files from a state sanatorium that had been demolished decades ago. The stagnant air down there was ice cold and smelled heavily of mold and wet earth. The ancient fluorescent tubes hanging from the low concrete ceiling buzzed constantly, occasionally dropping the long, narrow aisles into brief moments of complete darkness before violently popping back on. While dragging a heavy wooden crate marked 1962, restricted, out from a corner, the clerk discovered an uncatalogued reel-to-reel audio tape hidden at the bottom. Out of pure curiosity to break the monotony of the shift, he threaded the old magnetic tape into the playback deck on his desk and pressed down the heavy play button. The tape didn't contain any medical dictation or voices. Instead, it was a crisp recording of heavy, slow, dragging footsteps moving across concrete, accompanied by the unmistakable metallic clinking of rusted chains. As he listened, the clerk's stomach dropped. The exact rhythm of the footsteps on the tape perfectly mirrored his own movements from 5 minutes ago. When he held his breath to listen closer, the breathing on the audio recording stopped instantly as well. The power to the entire facility suddenly cut out, plunging the sub-basement into a pitch-black, suffocating void. In the dead silence, From the very far end of aisle 14, a heavy iron storage shelf was violently overturned, crashing into the concrete floor with an explosive bang. Then the audio from the tape came alive in the physical room. The slow, heavy dragging sound and the rattle of old metal chains began advancing down the narrow aisle toward the desk. The clerk slipped underneath the heavy oak desk, curling into a ball, staring out into the blackness of the floor. The sound of the chains grew louder, echoing off the narrow concrete walls as whatever was moving through the darkness approached his workstation. Every few seconds, the dragging would stop, followed by the sound of old paper files being violently ripped from the shelves and scattered across the floor. The temperature in the room dropped significantly, turning the clerk's ragged breath into visible plumes of white mist in the dark. He clutched his metal flashlight, too terrified to switch it on and give away his exact position. A pair of bare, ash-gray feet covered in dark sores stopped directly in front of his hiding spot under the desk. The metallic rattle of the chains settled onto the concrete with a heavy thud. In the absolute darkness, a long, withered hand reached down from the edge of the desk, its fingers blindly feeling along the wood, coming within inches of the clerk's shoulder. The sound of wet, heavy breathing filled the small space beneath the desk, accompanied by a foul, metallic odor that made his eyes water. The hand stopped moving, its elongated fingers freezing just above his head, as if listening for the next beat of his racing heart.